Hi there and welcome to my new video series where I'm going to be attempting to make a verb conjugator for Agēre in Excel. I've been wanting to churn out a few more videos for a while and quite like the idea of a workshop vibe for a video, and I've been working on this as a new project over the past few days, so I thought it would be quite interesting to have a look at. Special shout out to Salem the Conline, whose video on making a verb conjugator for Bâtonnier was incredibly interesting and really I think it paved the way for this video. The goal is to create a fully operational verb conjugator for Agēre which derives as much information as possible from a minimal number of input forms. So for example, let's say that this is our verb conjugator. If I give it the verb to create, I want it to be able to tell me that this is the infinitive in Agēre, give me the stem of the verb to which the endings are added, tell me the subclass, so the kind of endings that would need to be added to the verb, and do all the information by itself. In order to do that, first of all understand how verbs in Agēre work, then we have to create a lexicon and verb conjugation template, and finally input the Excel functions, which I think is really the scary bit, but we'll get onto that kind of one piece at a time. As far as understanding Agēre verbs go, they are at their simplest a stem and a connecting consonant plus an ending. So for example, the verb aras is made up of the stem ar as well as the appropriate ending as to give us the first person indicative active present ending in the singular, whereas another verb like engeames, M isn't actually part of the stem, but rather it is a connecting consonant which can vary, as we'll see down here, according to the inflectional form. So for example, a verb like iale would have a double L in the infinitive, a single L in the first person singular, and an R in the second person singular. It's important to note that while the connecting consonant can change, the stem can also change. Most notably, vowels change in a process called vowel breaking or lowering, which we'll get onto later. You can see the ones in red here for certain verbs in certain inflections are different from the forms in blue. And you can also have a specialized second past perfect stem, which again we'll get onto later. In terms of endings, these inflect for 2 voices, 2 moods, 4 tenses, 3 persons, 2 numbers, and 2 non-finite forms, examples of which can be given here. It's important to note that the second past perfect and the first past perfect differ in that the first past perfect, which can be exemplified here, is the stem plus a past perfect ending, while the second past perfect, as exemplified up here, makes use of the present tense endings with a different stem. Now that we understand a bit about the general verbal template for verbs in Agēre, we need to understand how we classify them. The first question is a verb regular? Regular verbs can take certain parts of the verb and use them to derive other parts, whereas irregular verbs can't. In this example, if you chop off the from arad and add s to get aras, you have another part of the verb, whereas you can't do the same thing with the verb to be, iete. The second question, if it is regular, is does it belong to a subclass? Verbs can either belong to regular subclasses if they end in the, or consonant subclasses otherwise. If it is regular, then there are 6 regular subclasses that it can fall into depending on the vowel or vowels which precede the infinitive ending. If it isn't regular, then it belongs to a consonant subclass. A consonant subclass can be identified by looking at the infinitive ending. The N, F, and P subclasses each have 3 subclasses within them, which makes it a little more complicated. So if you look at the F subclass here, there are 3 different types of endings which conform to what are known as the F1, F2, and F3 subclasses. The next question you have to ask is, once you know the subclass, which endings will the verb take? Now, regular verbs will take regular subclass endings. Here's an example of the first person singular, whereas consonant subclasses have 3 ending classes that they fall into, as exemplified here by differences in the first person plural. The next question to ask is whether it has a broken vowel and which type of vowel it has. As you can see from the example above, if I can find it, here we go, the verb ea interchanges with the verb a depending on the inflectional ending. However, there are other kinds of vowel breaking. For example, instead of ea and a switching between each other, you can have a and e switching between each other. You can also have ia and ua switching between each other. If a lot of this isn't making sense to you, it might be worth checking out my showcase video on Agēre, because it will go into more depth and explain precisely what these features are. But once you know whether a verb takes a broken vowel and essentially has 2 different stems, The question is, when do you use which stem? Well, in the present tense, that can be identified by looking at which subclass of endings the broken vowel will fall into. It's important to note as well that only consonant subclasses can have vowel breaking. Regular subclasses don't have vowel breaking for reasons that I really can't get into. But in the present tense, A and C subclasses have the broken vowel or the longer vowel in the infinitive in the first person singular, as exemplified by the forms here in red. The unbroken form is in blue, whereas B subclass endings have the broken vowel in the infinitive in first person singular, but also in the third singular, first and second singular, the imperative and the participle, which is again exemplified here, broken forms in red, unbroken forms in blue. In the future tense, there will always be an unbroken vowel, while in the past perfect and the past imperfect, there will be a broken vowel. Remember that the second past perfect has a different stem anyway, so asking whether the stem changes with a broken vowel doesn't really make any sense. The final thing that we need to know is whether the verb itself belongs to the S, P, or F subclasses, in which case it might fall prey to a process called vowel lowering, which only affects the present infinitive, first person singular, and the second person singular. So you'll see here that the vowel O in sopte, which is the verb to whistle, will interchange with the vowel U depending on the inflection. So the first person singular contains O, soves, while the first person plural contains the vowel U. There are two kinds, U-O lowering, where an U in the majority of forms will become an O. You can see here that the first person singular in the plural also contains an U, so this U is actually the base form and the O is the exception. The same process can also apply to E and A in other verbs. So now that we understand how verbs in Agēre work, we now need to start looking at principal parts. So the principal parts of the verb that you require to conjugate the verb in its entirety. It's worth noting that the infinitive isn't enough. For example, the verb engeante, to buy, has three possible first-person plurals. So if we look here, engamason is an N1 subclass with A endings because it ends in ason. Engeaneson is an N2B verb because it takes the B subclass endings. And engeangoson is an N3C verb. So if I just have the infinitive, it doesn't actually tell me which subclass the verb belongs to, and it doesn't tell me the kind of endings that it will take. So in order to do that, we need the first person plural, as exemplified here, because that specifies the subtype, it specifies the ending, and it also tells us whether there's vowel breaking or lowering that occurs. Now you could just say, well, if the verb engeante has a broken vowel, and you know that just by looking at the infinitive, because the infinitive will always contain a broken vowel, then you also know that the verb has vowel breaking. Absolutely. But unfortunately, if you don't know the endings, as we mentioned up here, then you don't know when vowel breaking will or won't apply. If you don't know if it belongs to an A or a B subclass, then you could be conjugating the verb wrongly. Also, vowel lowering can't be identified from the stem. It's entirely possible to have a verb that has an O in the infinitive and an O that persists all the way through the rest of the conjugational forms. So we do need the first person plural. We also need the second past perfect infinitive. It doesn't have to be provided for every verb because simply some verbs don't have a second past perfect. So that completes step one in understanding our verbs in Agēre. We've specified the information that we need to give the table in order for it to conjugate the verb for us. We've specified the information that's required to conjugate certain parts of the verb and how they interplay with each other. And we've specified the conjugational endings that are going to need to play a part, as well as ways that we can segment the verb and tell Excel to add the bits and pieces to each other to create the verb in its entirety. So I think that's enough for the first video. In the next video, we're going to be looking at creating a lexicon and verb conjugation template, and I think if we have time, we'll also be looking at inputting some basic Excel functions which are going to help us to complete that. I hope this has been interesting, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.